Welcome to today's episode of Decisions Now. I am your host, Erin Pearson, alongside my co-host, Rigvi Chavala. Today, we're very excited to have Steve Richard as our guest. He is the founder of ExecVision, which does conversation intelligence and sales coaching. Steve, welcome, and thank you for doing the podcast with us today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So one of the things I'm actually really excited about the topics that we have teed up for today is we've been talking a lot about how to use AI to help create decisions. And then today we're actually going to talk about a lot of the findings that you in particular have had from a sales angle about how sales teams are going, can and should be applying everything that you have been learning into their sales process. One of the things I just wanted to tee up before we get into those tactics is when you are looking at building these sales tools, how is AI, DA, data and analytics, or any other type of technology actually coming into play when you are pulling this all together?
Yeah, and it really is going to depend on the use cases. And one of the things that I think sometimes happens is people will go after AI for the sake of AI, as opposed to starting with a business challenge in mind. And then once they have, this is it might be a hypothesis at that point. Let's go after that. So I'll give you a couple of concrete examples of what I'm talking about there. A lot of companies that we're talking to, there's one that sells, funny enough, it's dumpsters. So, their motion is going to be driven by inbound leads. And for somebody like that, it becomes very important to understand, are my salespeople asking very specific questions, not scripted per se, but at least within certain veins. So applying AI to those conversations to understand, are they asking those things or not? Because we know our conversion rate is much higher when we ask them from lead to contract, from lead to customer, than if we don't, as an example. Or things like, if you think about marketing lead sources and campaign effectiveness, that's a big black box for a lot of people. They'll have some indications, based on work they've done around, cookie tracking or other, unique URLs and tracking like that. But really, for a lot of them, they don't really understand if their messaging is being applied in those follow-up calls and if that's being successful. So the first thing I think is you have to have a sense for the rest of the business analytics in your, portfolio data lake, however you're looking at that today. And then based on that, if you look at what's happening within conversation intelligence, you can apply that as an extra data point and layer of insight. The thing that I think a lot of people end up doing is they have a tendency to look at all data as being this absolute truth. Don't we wish it was that simple? Data is directional. No data source anywhere at any time is going to be 100% accurate. And as a result, if you can look at multiple data points and they're directional, directionally what they're telling you, and then you can fill in, like with conversational AI, the rest of what's happening within the conversations. Now all of a sudden we have a much better grasp of what is the story that this is telling. Is it telling the story that these marketing campaigns are highly effective, but then our people are dropping the ball when they call them? They're not using the messaging, they're not converting them effectively. Is it telling the story where we think the marketing campaigns are highly effective, but when push comes to shove, when we're actually talking to a prospective customer, that they're not having the conversation that our marketing team expected them to be having at that point? So maybe the marketing campaign needs to be tweaked. So all of this comes back to people should really have an understanding of the underlying data in the business and have some kind of a hypothesis moving in, so that rather than just collect as much data as we possibly can and look at it and just assume it's accurate, instead it's is it directionally accurate? And then do we have other data points that we can correlate against to start to say, this is the story it tells? And that's, I think, the thing that we really have to realize is it's all about telling stories of what's happening in the business so that you can make better decisions about the business.
That I think is great. Rigby, one of the things I actually had as a follow-up for you also is one of the things that we talk about a lot, and something, Steve, that I think you mentioned very eloquently, is data is great at finding those trends and really understanding what it is. And then you also need people to really do the research. And Steve, you guys do it through sales coaching as well, but you need somebody to be able to tell the story. So it's not just AI, it's not just DA that you need. You really need the data with the research, because you need the huge bits of data to find the trends alongside the research to understand why these are the trends. So Rigby, that's something that I know that you've been working on quite a bit.
Absolutely. I think you hit the point on the head, right? It's the directionally part of that data, and how do you make that determination, right? Of course, you need domain experts, like Erin said, because that's what your understanding of that domain is, right? Could be sales, could be marketing, but then also your models need to be built with that domain expertise in mind. And so that's the combination of those two is the only way you actually can get to that directional sense of where the data is going. And I think, in our case, we've always relied on our expertise at EvalueServe from a domain standpoint, and we built our AI to be sensitive to these domains, right? So we actually call them domain-specific AI. And I think, especially in your case, Steve, you guys are doing so many good solutions. It's not just conversational. You actually use that for coaching your sales teams. You do quality and compliance analysis. So, I mean, all these use cases are amazing, and kudos to all the work your team has been doing.
Well, I appreciate that. And Rigby, I'll give you kind of another example, I think, because I think the stories really help people take these abstract ideas and make them more concrete. So we have a very large, well-known, you would recognize their logo. Their logo's on most of the professional golfers' hats and shirt collars and things like that. And they have a very, very adept marketing demand generation organization selling in the HR software space. So they run so many campaigns. Honestly, most sales teams would probably be, their eyes would be green with envy with all of the campaigns and arrows in the quiver they give to the sales team. Although ironically, in their case, it actually has a little bit of a counterproductive effect in that they kind of feel like, here we go again. There's like they almost feel like the marketing organization's chasing bunnies. Now, if you look at you talk to the data analytics team, the data science team, they're gonna start talking about things like, how effective these marketing campaigns are driving leads, but how they're not understanding how they are getting stalled in the funnel, which is why they keep going after other marketing. So in their mind, the source of the friction is like, we need to adjust and tweak the campaigns. That's the thing that's not happening. It actually turns out it was a sales coaching challenge. So, and this is kind of the hopefully takeaway. If you're in data analytics of any sort, or biz ops or rev ops or those kinds of functions, or QA, I would really encourage you to don't just look at the data, also talk to the people. So, and that's what I think a lot, because those people, the data analytics folks, tend to be a little more introverted. They tend to be a little bit more like the answer will be in the numbers, and part of the answer is going to be in the numbers, but then you have to bounce it off there. So I was working with this customer of ours, and when I actually talked to the leadership in their case, the BDR organization, they've got a pretty large BDR organization, over 100 people. And they said, look, it's gotten to a point where we're feeling like we don't, I feel like our people are not even using the arrows in their quiver. They're not really even trying to do that, but we don't know. We don't know for sure. So whereas the data analytics people were going after like adjust the marketing campaigns, in reality, what was happening on the ground is that the sales team had lost their, I don't know, I guess stomach is the right word, to use the next marketing campaign. And as it turns out, there was this one where it was like a robot vacuum giveaway. So they were doing like a robot vacuum giveaway. And when we looked in the conversation intelligence data, when we just created a keyword topic for that, it's pretty straightforward, robot vacuum, Roomba. There's not a lot of words and phrases associated with that. And we ran it against it. It turns out that they weren't doing it. Nobody was, except for one person. Ironically, and if you looked at the one person's lead to opportunity conversion rates, they were much higher. Now, they weren't just doing that. They were using that as a way to earn the right to a conversation, to have the right conversation, to further qualify and then convert the lead into opportunity. So Rigby, what you're talking about with coaching, this becomes very concrete. The reason you measure things and the reason you do data analytics is to improve the business. And this is one that sometimes leaves me scratching my head because, again, I think a lot of people just kind of do data analytics for the sake of data analytics. That's not going to help anybody, right? You can have someone scoring calls all day, or you could have someone, running funnel math within Tableau or something all day long, and they're just, it's never going to ultimately result in something concrete to the business. So what did they do? They realized that the change they needed to make to the business was very concrete. We need to put these people into coaching plans and then actually measure coaching. So very counterintuitive. It's like, wait a minute, the problem with our lead to opportunity conversion rates not in the marketing campaign, it's actually in coaching the sales reps to believe and execute the sales call, the first unscheduled call, the way that it was intended to be executed using that marketing giveaway. And when they went down that path, lo and behold, the conversion rates went up pretty substantially, and everybody was pretty happy. So it's just, I think, an illustrative story that, you can get pretty wrapped around the axle in the data pretty quickly. You have to have the contextual information. You have to also talk to the people. And then from there, now what they're doing is they're measuring coaching as a KPI, which if you go to a typical analytics person, like, measuring coaching, you know what I mean? Like, isn't that kind of like squishy and soft? That's not really data analytics. Actually, it is, because it can have a lot of impact and effect on all the rest of the analytics you're looking at throughout your revenue machine. So just a food for thought.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it also validates partially like a hybrid approach that you do need the data analytics and you do need the coaching and the people to help motivate, share the story when you are working with a lot of clients. So one of the things, and Steve, I think you teed this up, is some of the things that we've learned from doing data analytics within sales intelligence. So you have gathered a ton of data from various conversations amongst the various clients that you've had. So for anyone who doesn't follow Steve on LinkedIn, pause this right now and go do that, because it's essentially a bachelor's degree in sales, right? Just there on his profile. So, Steve, what are some of the pieces that you've learned, especially around talk to listen ratio when you are on calls?
Yeah, so this one's pretty interesting. A lot of us have learned the 80-20 rule. Anybody who's in sales or sales performance, talk for 20% of the time, listen for 80% of the time. But that's actually a little bit of BS. It's a little not. It sounds good, but it's not based on any actual data. Data shows if it's an unscheduled, unexpected call, you really want to be floating around 50-50 or 60-40 in either direction. Because if you think about it, the person doesn't have any context. If it's a prospect or a customer, if they're not expecting to hear from you, there's no context. So the idea of getting on there and asking them 21 questions and just doing your discovery is probably pretty unrealistic. So you have to say something to earn the right to then ask the questions to get them talking. That's why it floats around 60-40. If you're dealing with a discovery call, which is a scheduled meeting, then all of a sudden it starts going closer to 80-20, but even then it's not. So if there are people who have analyzed, like Larry King, arguably, or Oprah, greatest interviewers of all time, right? People all acknowledge greatest interviewers of all time. They're still talking like 25% of the time when you do that analysis. So what it's saying is again, conversation's not going to be quite as clean as just ask one little tiny short question and then everybody just spills the beans. There has to be clarification. There, active listening. Hang on, I want to go back to that point. You just said this. I'm doing active listening. I'm paraphrasing what I heard. What did you mean by that? How did that make you feel? That's a clarification question. So all those little things become very important. So in talk-listen ratios, it very much depends on the call type. And what I can do, Aaron, is I can share, I wrote an article about this, that really your talk to listen ratios and how your conversation should look. I know that's sort of strange, but when you read the article, it makes sense. It depends dramatically based on your selling motion and your call type. Here's an example of a podcast where I'm probably going to end up doing 80% of the talking, but that's by design because I guess it's your podcast, right? Same with like a sales presentation. If you're in a sales presentation scenario and the buyer has a whole group of people on their side and they're expecting a demo or they're expecting some sort of a presentation of capabilities, if you start asking a bunch of discovery questions, you're misaligned, right? Like that's not where they are in their buying journey. They're expecting that you know their business. They've pulled together all the stakeholders and they're expecting you to deliver a presentation to them, to tell them something. that will help them in their decision-making process. So a lot of interesting things. And then I'll give you one more. So that's about the talk-listen ratio. If we change and talk about the topics, the keyword topics, what we find is that there are two that always bubble up and surface to the top of the list that you talk to every sales leader. What are the things that you'd love to have your salespeople do consistently in their calls that they're not doing today? And measuring across all of our customers' anonymous data, two things come to the top. One, concrete next steps. Everyone would agree a salesperson, especially in any sort of a multi-call close, 2, 3, 4 or more call close, should always close that call with scheduling a meeting and then have a mutual action plan with that prospect or customer, it might be a customer, with another scheduled meeting. It's shocking how infrequently that happens, where it's just open-ended and it ends like, all right, Aaron, I'll send you that information and I'll give you a call back in a couple weeks. That's usually what ends up happening. I'll give you a call back in a couple weeks. That's crazy. Now all of a sudden you're going to be chasing her around for all that time. Makes no sense. And then the other one is, and it comes up again and again and again, the lack of discovery. The lack of discovery where, everyone knows salespeople should be learning and doing that discovery. Sometimes they have to give a little peek in the window demo to earn the right to do the discovery. Nevertheless, the discovery has to happen. And you'll usually hear very, very basic questions like, what vendor do you use today? What does your current process look like? Maybe they'll ask a little about the pain, what's frustrating about that for you? And then as soon as they hear that, rather than doing any deeper discovery, what does that cost the business? How would you quantify the impact? Any of that stuff, they jump to solution. And we've kind of created the monster. We've created the monster in that when we onboard salespeople, what do we teach salespeople how to do? We teach them about the products and services. So then when they get on with a prospect or a customer, what do they talk about? The products and services. You know what I mean? They're doing what we've created for them to do. So that's an interesting area. And Rigby, what I think you're seeing the progressive companies do there is when they apply. I haven't seen this, but applying the AI essentially models against both the conversation intelligence information as well as all the other metrics and data points throughout the business. That to me is fascinating, to see things and patterns that are not there. So I'm just curious if you guys have done anything on that.
No, I learned something new. I didn't realize it's by call type. I think you put it pretty clearly there. It's not just a 80-20 rule, because I've heard of that many times. And it's almost like it's the writing on the wall, right? Everyone knows, just pass by, you see that. Okay, I know that, but you forget that there's nuances to that. So that's very interesting. But then you touched on one point about where you're delivering, like, where you have to talk more, like a sales presentation. Perhaps you're at an event or a conference. And again, this is something that even we're continuing to explore and help our customers in, is what we call conference analytics. And so that's where you're typically in the other end of the spectrum. You're 20/80, right? Or maybe 10/90, and where you're talking for 90% of the time. But then there's a lot of information there. How do you distill that? How do you, as a person who attends, I've attended so many conferences, 5 days in, I'm like, where are my notes? What did I attend, And so it's hard for me as a decision maker to come back and say, hey, let's focus on these 4 things. And it's even worse if I'm not there and I miss a conference and I just missed out on a lot of information there, right? So, from a conversational analytics or speech to text to data to analytics, that whole journey, I think has a lot of use cases and applications. And in fact, our customers have worked with us in several of these scenarios. We have a plan to kind of create a couple of products out of that as well.
Very cool. I'm be intrigued to see those when they come back. So we got to close that loop for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Love it. Yeah.
So one of the, questions that I would have, and Steve, I'd be curious what you guys are doing with this, because I would imagine this plays a pretty big role in the conversation intelligence. And Rigby, I know that you've developed solutions with this as well, but traditionally it started within customer experience, within call centers, also that you're measuring sentiment analysis when somebody calls in. How do they actually feel about the product? And you can, or the experience of working with somebody. So not only are you measuring literally what somebody is saying or how long they're speaking for, but you can measure the tone of voice that they have or what their behaviors are potentially post call as well. Are they likely to buy more later on? Are they likely to not renew a contract based on certain ways that the conversation goes? So how does that come into play when we're looking at the sales intelligence as well?
That one's fascinating. And I'm going to be able to answer this question. We're in the same category as some other big conversation intelligence providers. One that's quite notable, I'll just throw it out here, is Gong, because some people might be like, what is Exec Vision? We're essentially Gong without the revenue intelligence, instead more of a focus on coaching data. And I've actually run this by them, and we've had conversations about this, same with some of the other ones. In the call centers, in a typical B2C call center, so think like American Airlines, you know what I mean, or that type of an environment. Sentiment, because it's mostly driven by inbound calls. Sentiment analysis there's going to be a very, very strong relationship with a positive or a negative sentiment with things like Net Promoter Score or customer satisfaction scores. And they're the flagging of real-time negative sentiment. You know, someone starts cursing out one of my agents, therefore a supervisor can intervene, that kind of thing. We'll have a lot of use case and practical application. Okay, so that science has been in play for a long time. If you go to the call center events, and I've spent time at the call center events, been there, done that, right? But again, you're dealing with usually consumer, sometimes business. They're calling inbound, and it's more of a service or support use case as opposed to it being about sales. So, you know, there's a whole category of tools that exist for that. You think, you know, Verint, nice systems, Call Miner, Interactive Intelligence, Tether, and, you know, some of the other players, right? And that's what they're really good at, those big B2C call centers, mostly inbound. And by the way, that could be about chat, text, because these days, social media, I mean, someone might have a nasty gram tweet at you. I got to pick that up. It's negative sentiment. Doesn't matter. In the context of sales, and this doesn't matter if it's B2B sales or B2C sales, which is fascinating. If you think about sales, we're trying to, you know, salespeople create pain. So it turns out when we did our CTO, Ruben Furman, he did this analysis with our data scientists at the time, and we were all excited because, you know, a hypothesis a lot of our customers have coming in is like, sometimes I think that the salesperson gets frustrated and that creates a negative effect on our conversion rates. Turns out that's not the case at all. Actually, we were finding that there was actually more of a relationship between calls that have swear words in them or had a negative sentiment analysis because there was dynamic tension in the conversation. So we have the ability to highlight certain snippets, green for quote unquote positive sentiment where there's a high degree of rapport. Rapport is not defined by talking about the weather. Rapport is defined as people on the same page in terms of you know, the sentiment of what's happening in the call. And negative sentiment, which is highlighted red, it actually turns out there was a stronger relationship with negative sentiment, so much so that it wasn't clear. That it also isn't clear that, so then people, if they took that to the natural conclusion, go, well, that means you should probably drop 4-letter words in your sales calls. No, that's not right. However, it actually turns out if the prospect or the customer in the context of a sales call drops a 4-letter word, if they curse, there's a higher likelihood of the call closing, of the deal being won. So because you know why? People just like to swear, you know, and you'll experience this in your own. Actually, if someone feels comfortable enough with you to swear on a call, that's actually a pretty good indication of high rapport, even though it's going to show up as a negative sentiment in many cases because of how they do it. So it's tricky. You know, in the future, I would suspect that, who knows, maybe you guys could do this, where AI could be applied to the notion of what does a B2B sale look like, what does a B2B sale look like, and then within that, you're going to have the different call types like we talked about before. Some sales motions are going to be entirely inbound lead driven, and I'll give you a real concrete example. We work with a company that does consumer debt refinancing. Okay, so basically debt consolidation in addition to repairing the consumer's credit. And it's very sad. There's a massive debt problem in this country, like a massive debt problem. So what ends up happening is if people get into too much credit card debt and they're getting charged these insane interest rates, you know, 17, 18%, they're looking to consolidate all that debt under another another lender, and then they're looking to repair their credit along the way, drop their payments, because at some point their payments are their interest rate's so high their payment all goes to interest. They could never pay down the principal. It's not possible. So in a situation like that, it's going to be driven by an inbound call for the most part, because these people are pretty desperate, and because they're pretty desperate, you're going to see a whole lot of negative sentiment up front. So in a situation like that, like a domain-specific AI application, I would suspect there's a lot of things you could do with AI around that can help inform you which of my inbound, consumer calls are the ones that are the highest likelihood of closing, and then tie that back to, for example, what marketing advertising source were we doing? Were we advertising on Facebook? Were we advertising on Instagram? Were we advertising on banks' websites? I have no idea. You see what I'm saying? Or Google AdWords. So there's a lot of things there. Versus if you're in a B2B context, and if you're in a B2B context, and you're have someone who's requesting to talk to a salesperson, that sentiment analysis for that scenario is going to be very different. The person who's requesting to talk to a salesperson probably has a positive sentiment because they're buying, they want to learn, they're gathering information. It's not like you're cold calling them. And along the way, ironically, if the salesperson can create a little bit of a negative sentiment followed by a positive sentiment, that pattern seems to be more related to a successful outcome in winning the deal. But ultimately, the salesperson's got to ask some tough questions like, who else are you talking to? Because if it's an inbound lead, they're probably talking to a lot of other companies. Or what is that big challenge and pain point you're dealing with to try to solve this? Versus if you're in a customer renewal situation, we probably want to have that sentiment overall be more positive. So we didn't get to that level of depth of applying AI models against that. But when you look at sentiment, to kind of net this all out, in B2C and B2B sales, which ultimately results in revenue, we're not seeing the strong relationship we saw in the call centers and the service and support, where there's a strong relationship between sentiment and NPS. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sorry, a little rambly, but I figured that was an interesting way to think about it, because we were surprised. And when I was able to compare notes with the other vendors in the space, they said the same thing. They're like, yeah, we get a lot of requests from sentiment, but we don't have any work that we've done on it has proven to not yield anything that we can productize, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So. Yeah. In fact, if you take another domain like financial services, we do earnings call transcripts, and the need there is also to understand the sentiment of what they're trying to say, what's the guidance of the next quarter, next year, right? So huge applications here.
And then that goes to I'm assuming Rigby, like the hedge funds and the asset managers, and that can be another data point in their analysis to try to figure out if they're going to buy, hold, sell, etc.
Yep. Yeah. And if you're a long short, you want to look for negative sentiment. So where we are, I think, is that the voice does give it away. So we built on open source models that are available, but then you have to build on top of them for domain specific. And what we found is the one thing that is very true is, like, if you're listening to a call, and if our AI has identified a negative sentiment or a positive sentiment, and you listen to that part, you hear it too. So the good news is it seems to be quite accurate at understanding where it is. What still we need to do more work on, I think, is contextualizing where it is for specific use cases, right? Yeah, I think the contextualizing, that's where kind of the deep neural networks come into picture, right? Because you just don't take that sentence in its own right. You have to listen to the before and the after to say, oh, he was just cursing someone else versus cursing the situation, right? For example. Yeah.
So one of the things that I guess we've been talking about a lot is, how do you take all of this data and then make it like predictive and prescriptive to what people are doing? Though anywhere in an organization where you're applying AI, DA, and all of this research, there's a gap in getting the information. We touched on this a bit in the beginning. In particular, there's a gap to get the information and actually apply it. Part of that's because of how it's actually delivered to people. But I think, and to keep on trend with sales today, there's also this notion internally that people are like, I can do it better. I've been in sales for 30 years. Why would I listen to this thing when I have my own proven method that I'm going to stick with? So, Steve, I was just curious, do you have any advice from the sales coaching side of what you guys do that actually works really well in helping people really understand and apply this information?
Yeah, there's an axiom from my mentor, Tom Snyder, old mentor Tom Snyder. He taught me that people value more what they conclude for themselves than what they're told. People value more what they conclude for themselves than what they're told. And this becomes a hard thing for some analytical business leaders to wrap their mind around, because the beauty of analytics in the context of, let's say, like supply chain management is I can pull a lever. Yeah, I can make a decision about the supply chain. I can measure the impact, the positive or negative impact that it had on my ability to deliver, our product on time and on budget, et cetera. And it's very, very clear. There's a Six Sigma methodology behind it. Like, awesome. Sales we're doing with people. People are not marketing campaigns. I can't tweak my Google AdWords a little bit. So people have to they have to conclude for themselves rather than be told what to do. So how do you go about doing that? Get people involved in their own development. So one of the biggest insights, because you can have a data-driven coaching culture, and I'll explain what that means in a second. But in order to do that, you have to get the people to want to change. Like, have you ever tried to get an anti-vaxxer to get the shots? I had to deal with that with my dad. We finally got them, but it took a long time. It was brutal, right? He lives way up in the middle of nowhere in Maine. It's almost impossible. He had to conclude for himself. And in his case, it was his cancer doctor who said, Roger, he said it in 13 words, what I tried to get my dad to do in 13 months, and he got it done immediately. So once that person buys into, making a change, get them involved in their own development, flip the coaching paradigm on its head. Because the coaching paradigm traditionally is one sales manager, 7 to 12 direct reports. It's a math problem. Because we know the best practice according to Corporate Executive Board, which is now part of Gartner, where I used to work, is 1 hour per rep per week of coaching. That is the best practice. We want to aim for 3 to 5 hours per rep per month of coaching. If I'm a manager and I've got 10 direct reports, 10 hours out of my 40 to 50 hour work week is poof, gone. And by the way, that's just call coaching, let alone deal coaching or career path conversation, or there's lots of coaching. So what our customers ask us to do is help us track all the coaching in one place. We need to actually measure if the coaching is happening, and it doesn't have to just be one-on-one, it can be small group. So a concrete thing that we're seeing a lot of companies do is they stop and they say, who should we coach, first of all? And as a general rule of thumb, where do they spend all their time? If they look at their sales team and they map it out on a bell curve and they say, I've got my A players, my B players, and my C players, where do they spend all their time? Low performers, C players. You could, and there's other research from CB that shows if you focus on your C players, they don't get that much better. Because the reality is that they're miscast. They're the wrong person for the role. Like, it would be like me playing Juliet and Romeo and Juliet. I could put a wig on and fake it all day, but it's sooner or later it just doesn't work. I'm putting a wrong role. I should be playing somebody else in that, probably the father at this point, right? So instead, the middle 60% is where you get all the gain. You get a little bit of gain off of your A players. But again, you look at what sales leaders do. They spend all their time with their A players and their C players. So they're burning all these coaching calories and they're not getting the business results. So what do? Shift it. And this is where you can measure it. So if you have, let's say, 4, 5, 6 B players on your team, do a 1 hour per week small group coaching with them doing call coaching. 1 hour of your time as a manager with maybe 30 minutes of prep, so an hour and a half, creates 5 people hours of coaching. You see what I mean? So even if you're not listening to the calls of one of the 5 people, they're all kind of in the same cohort. They're all kind of going through their learning cycle the same way. That is a very impactful thing. And then you can measure it. And if there are people who, because I said people value more what they conclude for themselves than what they're told, in our system, people are mapped against skill versus will. So if you have people who are hitting their numbers consistently, but they have no desire to change, they don't want to be coached. Just leave me alone and let me do my job. Those are kind of lone wolf salespeople. Well, you have a decision to make. If they're not being disruptive of everybody, leave them alone. Don't force them to be a part of the coaching program. If anything, they're going to take away from other people because they're going to be bitching and moaning about it. They're like, oh, I don't want to be here, right? Or grumbling, during breaks. So instead, what do? Focus on the people that are high desire and will to change, but maybe not the most skillful, those B players, the people who are onboarding. And we're going to measure what's happening there. Are they going back and reviewing and listening to one of their own calls a week? Do we have what are called smart alerts set up? So within our system, there are smart alerts. And what it'll do is if there's a call that has all these keyword topics, these trackers, we can surface it like, hey, this is Aaron Pearson had just executed like the perfect customer success call or, sales call. Like this was awesome. Alternatively, we could have a smart alert that says, show me the calls where maybe you did basic level qualification. How many servers do you have? But then you never asked about discovery questions like business challenges. So we can surface calls that have coachable moments. Are they doing that? And if they are they actually clicking on the calls? And then are they commenting on them and scoring the call against a framework? You also have to define good for your different call types. What is that definition of good in terms of those behaviors that we're measuring in those call types? And again, all of this feeds into the data and analytics, because if you have a coaching program like that, we can see, is it happening or not? Is there consistency? Is there accountability? Are people executing it the way they should or not? And if the answer is not, then what a shocker. We're not going to see the behavior change, and we're not going to see the increase in conversion rates, win rates, and revenue. It just doesn't follow.
Yeah. No, I think that's awesome. And also being able to merge the personality types with data in order to really make it more effective and to really improve the business, and understanding that there is a learning curve to this and you can't force it upon people all at once. And sometimes you have to lead by showing success at the top of the pack so other people want to get on, because not everyone wants to be the first person to cross the chasm. Some people want to do it after it's been proven by a few other of those brave souls.
So can I spend a quick second on that?
Sure.
One of the mistakes people make, let's say you have a sales team of 100 people. Let's say 20 of those 100 are consistently hitting quota, 60 are not really hitting quota, and you're bringing on average 20 new salespeople per quarter. Go to the people who are already out there and offer this as an option. It's an opt-in program. It's not forced upon them. Some of them will opt in, some of them won't. That's fine. Anybody who's coming in as a new hire, this is part of how we operate. All of your calls, your sales calls are going to be recorded automatically in a compliant way. Nobody's going to have to think about it. You're not going to have to hit a button or ask for it to be recorded, any of those kinds of things. And the analytics are going to happen. The smart alerts are going to fire. It's just part of how we operate. Once a week, we're going to do a call review. You're going to listen to and score one of your own calls. It's just part of how we operate. If you do it that way, what you ideally want is a scenario. We see this in our customers. It's fascinating. Where initially the old dogs that are like, leave me alone, they start to see the new dogs doing real well. And they're like, what are they doing over there? I want to make more money. I thought I had all the answers, but maybe I don't. And they actually opt in, but they opt in later on to the program. And the thing that's really beautiful about the cloud is it's all measurable. So the number one most important, and we've measured this across our customers and internally at our companies, and it holds. The number one thing that you can do for a new hire, for someone who's starting on board, is actually listening to your own calls for the first 3 months. The people who listen to even one of their own call, which is just like watching your game tape as an athlete, And oh, by the way, you don't even need to watch it with a coach. You just need to watch it with your scorecard, with your 8 key behaviors, and score it. If you listen to one of your own calls as a new hire sales rep per week for 3 months, then your probability of success is almost 100% that you're going to be at quota attainment. And it's actually better than listening to a bunch of other people's calls. It's good to listen to other people's calls too, but listening to your own blows away, because you can make those adjustments and you can kind of see, and you have to listen to it with that rubric, with that scorecard. Does the rep ask questions about these 3 things in discovery? Well, if I'm being honest, I didn't do it. I did not attempt that behavior, right? And now I go, okay, well, heck, I probably should attempt that behavior. I've concluded that for myself, and therefore I'm going to change it. So the next week when I listen, I go, yeah, I did that this week, right? And I did a much better job. That's what drives the behavior change. So everyone listening to that, get everyone listening one of their own recorded calls per week. It makes a massive difference. Massive.
Yeah. Once you get over the hump of not wanting to listen to your own voice.
Well, I'm curious with this podcast. Do you listen to your own podcast, Rigby and Aaron?
Not not the whole thing. I just skip.
He skips the part where he's talking, I'm sure.
That's right.
Which is too bad because you're very good.
No, there you go. Thank you.
Anecdotally, I did that at one of my first jobs. Somebody forced me to do it after I was on a call. It was like my first few weeks or months there, and it was very painful process. The first time you do it makes a world of a difference because you have to be honest about where you are. When you look back on it, you make excuses. You're like, I'm sure I did that. I would have totally done it. You didn't do it. So just because you maybe thought of it doesn't mean you executed on it. But I do have one last question for you today, Steve. So I do try to end on kind of a fun note. One of the things I know that you quite enjoy is to go skiing. So when is the last ski run of the year, or has that already happened already now that it's the end of March?
Yeah, it was my best and saddest. Crested Butte, we were there for a guy's trip. And I usually ski with the kids. I've got 4 kids ages 6, 8, 10, and 12. So most of the time I'm at Whitetail in Pennsylvania, which is a nice little hill. It's got a high-speed quad. It's spring skiing every week there. But a Crested Butte guys trip, and it snowed. We were there for 5 days. It didn't snow one flake the 5 days. At the last day, we were 8 inches of fresh. So I got 4 runs, but then we had to get the skis off and go put them in the airplane. So
Oh no. Well, at
better
least you got
than
one.
none, right?
Let's end it on
that's
a high
true.
note.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed it, and looking forward to continuing the conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.